Hello everybody and welcome back to Beastcoast Pokemon. Today, James, Beck, and I are here to preview the Hartford Regional Championships. This tournament's going to be taking place on May 20th, or that weekend specifically. It is currently slated to be one of the largest Pokemon VGC tournaments in the history of the game, with 769 players registered as of the day we're making this recording, which is just about a week before the event. So James and I are here to preview the players, preview the metagame. There's been a lot of development in the format. Of course, we'll be playing the Regulation C format, which allows for the Rune Pokemon to be allowed. I mean, James, you're going to be there at the event, right? How are you feeling? How's your preparation going?
For me, this is more of a tournament. Like, I know it's probably really stacked, but I feel pretty good. I mean, I'm just going there because it's literally a regional championship that I can get to an hour and a half without flying from New York, so it should be pretty fun, and I think it's a pretty convenient regional location. That's why we're seeing a lot of players, and it's definitely going to be stacked. One of the biggest tournaments. I feel like the East Coast events are always just going to be super large. We have a huge player base, and we have a lot of strong players that can just easily attend, so should be a really exciting event, especially to watch from home.
The convenience of the location is a big deal for this regional in particular, because there are a lot of players in New England and the Northeast that are able to access it just by driving, a few hours, and so this one's going to be a big one to pay attention to. The East Coast players this year in particular have done super well. If you look at the European International Championships, there were 3 North American players that finished in the top 8. Paul Chua won the tournament. Alexandra DeAndrea finished 3rd place, and James Evans, who was the NAIC champion last year, finished 5th place. All 3 of those players are actually from the state of New Jersey. So obviously, being from the East Coast, these are some of the biggest names to pay attention to. There are a lot of other really prominent big names on the East Coast, including yourself, James. WolfeyGlick, of course, as well, who's had a tremendous season. I'm excited to see this one just because I feel like the North American players this season have just been absolutely killing it. It is so hard to win these tournaments, and I'm excited to see who ends up taking it.
Yeah, we're definitely going to have a lot of strong players, including, we've already mentioned before, we had Luca Tregut, who has been on a tear recently, got top 4, had his most recent 2 regional championships, and has gotten top 8 at both global challenges that he competed in, which that is no small feat. We also have, of course, Joseph Ugarte and Nick Navarre, both players who have been doing really well. They got 1st place and top 4 at the recent Portland Regional Championship. They actually have already finished their BFL for regional championships. You know how crazy that this regional is going to be.
Yeah, and for context, the way that championship points works is you get points for your 6 best tournaments at regionals or special events this season. And so given that we're towards the end of the season, a lot of players have actually reached that 6 limit already. I was talking to Wolf, and I think Wolf has actually finished top 16 or better at 6 regionals already. And
yeah.
So in order to, get points, you'd have to get even further than that. And so I do think for this event, there are, for some of those players that have attended a ton of events that have done so well already, there's a little bit maybe less pressure in the sense that you're like, okay, I've already accumulated so many points. I can't really get that many more unless I'm winning. So might as well just have more fun with it, or maybe give it my all and, try out maybe something that's a little bit more unconventional. I think Nick Navarre is a player that I've really had my eye out on this season. Easily one of the most consistent players and team builders. I think he's made day 2 or better basically at all of the last 6 events that he's been to, which is an unbelievable line of consistency. Like, him and Wolf feel like the 2 most consistent North American players in terms of just always being in the top 16, top 32, always being in day 2. The East Coast tournaments are always so stacked. So many of the best players reside on the East Coast right now as well. Although it's funny, if EUIC was about the East Coast players, then OCIC was about the West Coast players, where all the California players, literally all from like LA, managed to finish in the top 8 as well. So yeah, I mean, North America, I feel like it's just so strong this season. But moving on from the players, let's talk a little bit about the metagame, the format, where we think things are right now, and what you expect to see at Hartford.
Yeah, so if you haven't already checked out our previous Beast Coast video where we went over the Portland Regional Championship and the Sao Paulo Regional Championship, highly recommend you go checking that out. We already had a big layout of thoughts over there. Basically, we've noticed a trend where Palafin balance has been a little bit on the decline recently, especially Palafin itself. Fluttermane is still on the rise. We've seen more weather teams. Overall is definitely shifting towards a more open field, and I think it's just the nature of like as a series progresses, and we've actually had more time with this series more than like any other series so far. So there's still a lot of room for growth, and players are just exploring like what options there are.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. To me, I do think people talk about the idea of comfort a lot. I do think it's really important. For example, if you're using an unconventional team or a Pokemon that people don't have that much experience fighting against, just having an edge and being really kind of well versed in your matchups gives you a really big edge. And if you are using something like standard Palafin balance, you really have to know how to, use those tools consistently, because players are now really going out of their way to counter these strategies as much as possible, right? And so Palafin and those balance balanced teams in general, still solid, but of course, a little bit harder to maybe execute well. And I know, James, you and I were talking about your experience in Portland, and you were saying you actually didn't really fight against too many of those teams. And I think that's one thing that's interesting. I think a lot of people may be going out of their way to prepare for this one team, but now with its usage declining, maybe you're not going to see it as frequently as you expected to see it. And like, I prepared for it really hard for EUIC. I think I played maybe 2 or 3 out of like the 9 rounds, and I also played like 3 Dondozos, which I wasn't expecting to go up against, right? So at the end of the day, at these tournaments, like, you can only be so prepared for everything. It's important to not over-index, I think, on one matchup and then under-index on everything else.
Yeah, absolutely. I think for the next couple events, especially, we're going to see more of comfort picks and just being able to have a team that you know your ins and outs, where matchup doesn't really matter as much as like your ability to play the team and know your win cons against like a large majority of possible things you could encounter.
We talked a little bit about this in our overview of the last couple of regionals. To me, I think the big things going into Hartford, I don't expect to see too many like crazy meta shifts. I think it's going to be a lot of similar kind of teams to what we've seen in Portland and EUIC, for example. Weather has been on the rise, not really in terms of usage rate, right? But in terms of really high level players being able to execute them super well, with 3 different weathers represented in the top 8 of Portland regionals: Jumpluff Sun, Abomasnow, plus Choice Specs Iron Bundle, and then Tyranitar Lycanroc. Palafin usage has declined substantially, as we've already covered. Fluttermane's still everywhere. At Portland, out of the top 16 teams, 15 of them had Fluttermane, and so this Pokemon is not going anywhere anytime soon. One thing that I also think is actually really interesting, that I realize now we didn't talk about as much in the Portland recap, is Great Tusk kind of rising up again. Out of the top 4 teams actually at Portland, 3 of them had Great Tusk. And I feel like Great Tusk at EUIC just wasn't nearly as represented. I don't think there was a single one in the top 8. And then I think 9th place had it. But if you look through like 10 through 16 at that event, there were no Great Tusks. So it feels like this Pokemon is really coming back into the format in full force. And it makes sense. I think there's just a lot of Pokemon are weak to ground types attacks and fighting type attacks right now.
Yeah, it's really nice. As someone who used Great Tusk at Portland, the overall damage you can do with it is absolutely insane. The lack, again, Palafin balance didn't exactly have the best switches to ground type attacks. So, and again, the format just like doesn't have many like flying types, or you have to use Terra Flying or Terra Grass basically. But just being able to like destroy a lot of teams with ground coverage, and then like fighting coverage is also just really nice because you can hit things like Terra Normal Dragonite. You have obviously the Ruin Pokemon that you can just hit with close combat, Iron Bundle. There's a lot of Pokemon that just Great Tusk can hit, and it's why we've seen like, I think in Series 2 we saw more of a rise in Garchomp towards the later parts, especially with like Gabriel Agati winning a regional with the Garchomp. But Great Tusk has just been coming back stronger, I think, and I think a new adjustment too. We saw a lot of Focus Sash and Life Orb, and now I think like Choice Scarf, even without the Sun teams, like Choice Scarf and Life Orb have probably been the more dominant sets recently.
Yeah, I think actually all 3 of the ones that finished in the top 4 at Portland had Choice Scarf specifically. And so taking advantage of the fact that, you know, Great Tusk isn't exactly the fastest Pokemon, with that Choice Scarf, you can now outspeed Fluttermane that isn't, you know, booster energy, for example. There's so many specs Flutters around in the format right now. So Tusk being able to just pressure Headlong Rush for a one-hit knockout onto Flutter in particular is really nice. And so, yeah, that's one Pokemon in particular that I have my eye out on for going into Portland, especially given its recent performance in North America. You know, if I were currently competing and if I were to go into Hartford, like the main things I'd want to make sure I have at least some matchup that I've thought about against are still Palafin balanced teams, you know, like the ones that did really well at EUIC. Dondozo, Tatsugiri, like that's still really good, whether it be the G-Shore variant with Fluttermane or the ones that did really well at EUIC with Dragonite. I'd still want to be prepared for those. And I'd at least want to think about how I'd fight against Jumpluff Torkoal as a lead, Tyranitar Lycanroc as a lead, and Abomasnow Bundle as a lead. Not that I think like too many people will be using them, but I wouldn't have like no matchup against them. And then Orthworm did win regionals over in Sao Paulo as well. And so that's one other Pokemon to pay attention to. But as always, you can't really be prepared for everything. So I think what's most important is just playing a strategy that you feel really comfortable with and then executing it properly. What's interesting is, you know, we've been playing Regulation C for a while at this point. One of the big questions I have is like, do we really see any huge meta shifts from this point on? And honestly, Portland, there was a lot more interesting stuff than I would have expected in that tournament. So I still think there are a lot of different viable strategies in Pokemon that are, you know, maybe still a little bit underexplored. I personally really love Trick Room. I think it's still underused. I would love to see Trick Room have a stronger performance. I know that's something that people were using a little bit, especially with Bronzong in the last few weeks, but hasn't really picked up in usage. So that's one thing I have my eye out on for. And then we also haven't seen Wo-Chien just nearly as much as all the other 3-room Pokemon. It's obviously a lot harder to use, but I do think that Pokemon may be a little bit underplayed right now. So those are the 2 things I'd love to see coming out of Hartford. Not sure we actually will, but what about you, James?
I think we're probably going to see just variants of teams we've seen before. I think we'll probably still be seeing maybe Dundoza with maybe like a new trick or two. We'll probably see maybe, I don't know about Palafin balance, but I think Arcanine, Amoonguss, and Fluttermane, I think we'll just see more balanced teams of that. Maybe people will drop the Palafin, for instance, and maybe go back to things like we've seen in Series 2. I think Iron Bundle, for instance. I also am pretty interested on what the Ruin Pokemon usage will be like at this tournament, because something we didn't talk about in Portland is I felt like in Portland, we saw more teams without Ruin Pokemon actually be able to do well throughout. So I think the question is, are we going to need the Ruin Pokemon still? Are we going to see teams that are just more equipped and don't need the Ruin ability? Or are we going to see teams that are just taking advantage of Ruin abilities better? Because it's still a little bit tricky. I don't think I've seen many teams that hard abuse the Ruin abilities to maybe their full potential. So I'm kind of curious if that will be something we'll be able to see at Hartford.
This is slated to really be one of the largest events ever. So it's going to be really exciting. Of course, streamed live on the Pokemon, Twitch, and YouTube channels. James will be there as a competitor as well, and I will be watching from home. So hopefully this has given you a quick summary of what to expect from this tournament. So many amazing North American players will be competing, and of course the metagame has been evolving rapidly as well. So we'll see if it ends up being just like the teams that we've seen from the last couple of weeks, or whether or not there's any new crazy strategies that pop up. But of course, tune in this weekend to check out how the Hartford Regionals plays out. And thanks as always for joining James and I here at Beastcoast Pokemon.